Many Canadians want Canada to become the 51st state.
You can always become a state.
And I said, then you should be a state.
Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
Greenland have been part of the Danish kingdom for 800 years.
We need Greenland for national security purposes.
It is not for sale.
We are facing a more uncertain reality.
Let me put it in words you might understand.
They should be a state.
The Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China, we gave it to Panama.
Mr. Trump, off.
He said Canada would dissolve.
We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
It's official. Manifest Destiny is so back. And thanks to some military officers in the 1920s and 30s, we actually have war plans to invade a bunch of these places. Believe it or not, in 1974, the United States declassified war plans, this one codenamed War Plan Rad, that planned for the invasion of Canada and a wider war with England. And we had plans for a bunch of different countries, including in Latin America and the North Atlantic. And with some of President Trump's recent statements, it seems like now is a good time to go over the history of America having plans to invade our neighbors 100 years ago, as well as a couple actual invasions throughout our history. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, follow me on X and Instagram, and let's just get right into it. So let's just start with Canada. America's military relations with Canada date back to 1775 and are even older than the Declaration of Independence. As the Revolutionary War started, the Continental Congress commissioned a northern campaign to take Quebec and Montreal. The goal was not only to quote-unquote liberate Canada from England and absorb it into the blossoming nation, but also to deprive the English of access to the Hudson River, which was arguably the key geographic feature of the entire American Revolution. The initial attacks successfully took Montreal, but the American effort stalled at a siege of Quebec City. British reinforcements arrived and the US had to retreat, leaving Canada to the English and giving them access to the Hudson, which would later lead to the critical Battle of Saratoga in 1777. Things revved up again decades later with the 1812 War, where America resumed hostilities with England. America attempted a few incursions into Canada that were even less successful than the previous war, only making temporary marginal gains in Ontario and Lake Erie, and burning the Canadian provincial capital of York. English counterattacks offset these victories and even saw English forces return the favor and occupy American territory. By mid-century, America and England were on good terms, and both nations expanded their realms with colonization alongside each other. But as the last decades of the century approached, there were some mild concerns, most notably in South America. In 1895, the Venezuela crisis erupted, seeing a border dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana over an area with large gold deposits. Citing the Monroe Doctrine, President Grover Cleveland stepped in to arbitrate the dispute and sided alongside the Venezuelans, even threatening military force against England if they did not comply. England acquiesced to the American demands and the dispute was resolved peacefully, but it was the closest that the US and England had come to war since 1815. Around this time, junior officers in the US military actually began to draw up plans for war with England. Crucially, we need to keep something in mind for these war plans. None of these were made out of a serious concern for war with England. Instead, they were hypothetical exercises that allowed American officers, especially in the naval and army academies, to practice planning operations against a powerful enemy. Congress had nothing to do with any of these plans and probably didn't even know about them. Instead, they were concerned with solidifying and defending US power abroad. At the time, America didn't really have any powerful enemies, and England was only one of many nations that the US developed these rather hypothetical plans for. The strongest case to be made for a US-England war in this time was the Thucydides trap, a concept in geopolitics that states that as a challenging power arises, the hegemonic power will start a war to keep the rising power down and maintain its own status. As outlined by Graham Allison, the modern Western world has seen 16 shifts in who the dominant power is, and 14 of these shifts have seen war. In the 1890s, the US officially became the wealthiest nation in the world and was well on its way to creating a massive navy, challenging England as the dominant world power. However, this transition of power was peaceful with an era known as the Great Rapprochement, where England willingly allowed the US to take a greater role on the world stage and cooperated with them. The two nations generally had aligned interests and, of course, similar language and culture, with American imperialism mostly being confined to the Western Hemisphere and not really interfering with English aspirations, and there was a mutual interest in global seafaring trade. Anyways, back to the war plans. The first big plans for war with England in this time was developed by Captain Alfred Mahan in 1890, who, again, did this more for the strategic planning process rather than concerned with England per se. Mahan grappled with the fact that England had a far superior navy to the US, and due to the naval constraints, he felt that America would have to confine their conflict to the Western Hemisphere. But this reserved posture was only geographic, and Mahan actually proposed a very offensive strategy against the English Navy once they were in the area. Well-defended American naval installations would enable the US fleet to selectively attack English ships or bases in the region, forcing the larger navy to either disperse, commit more ships, and leave the homeland open, or simply not defend some of their interests. Torpedo fleets would mainly harass English warships, while fast cruisers would target shipping. Closer to home, Mahan also argued for the US to control Lake Ontario, cutting off the Great Lakes from English resupply, while staging operations to take the English naval base at Halifax, as well as the nearby Canadian coalfields, to rob the region of critical energy. Notably, Canada did not have its own navy in 1890, and relied solely on English naval protection. 4 years later, the Navy War College began issuing an annual problem for their students, where they would collaborate to develop a strategic solution to a given scenario. The first 2 years of the annual problem, in 1894 and 95, around the time of the Venezuela crisis, the proposed scenario was defending the US, either New York or New England, in the event of a war with England in the Northwest Atlantic. The students fleshed out Mahan's strategy more and updated it for the realities of the Navy at the time, notably reducing the number of battleships available from 12 to 5. Various other changes were made, such as basing the battle and torpedo fleets in different places, but generally the concept of a concentrated battle fleet with a hit-and-run Mosquito torpedo fleet remained the same. Their plans also went into detail on repurposing ships into torpedo vessels, and even recommended recruitment strategies such as prize money and local sailing assignments. In World War I, the US, Canada, and England all fought together, and after the war, there was little concern that another major power war would break out, at least for a little bit. American concerns at this time were mostly around imperial maintenance, as well as assisting the League of Nations peace operations, even if the US wasn't actually a part of the League. Still, the US maintained and developed new plans in the event of war, some even before the US joined World War I. War Plan Black, for example, looked at naval defense against Germany in the event that they had defeated France. Gold planned for French aggression in the Caribbean, brown for a Philippines revolt, olive for Spain, silver for Italy, tan for invading Cuba, gray against Central America, green for Mexico, violet for South America, and yellow against China. There was even War Plan White, which prepared for civil unrest in the United States, and parts of this plan were actually used to put down the Bonus Army demonstrations in 1932. Later plans were created as well closer to or during World War II, including War Plan Purple, which envisioned an Axis-aligned South American nation threatening the Panama Canal, and Indigo, which planned for the occupation of Iceland as a resupply point between the US and England. In general, these plans were seen as relatively unlikely, although some, like tan and brown, were more likely than others, like gold or silver. Still, two other plans were seen as the most important ones. By far, America's greatest concern for war was the subject of War Plan Orange, the Japanese Empire. After World War I, Japan had been strengthened navally, and a growing tension between Japan and the West made conflict even more likely. If any war was to break out, the thought went it would be here, and of course they ended up being right. But that's not the focus of today's video. That is actually on the Atlantic side. Of all the European powers, none were very likely to go to war with America during this time. Germany and Russia were seen as far too weak, and they didn't even have interwar plans made against them for this reason. France, Italy, and Spain were all navally weak and had little stake in the Western Hemisphere, making them unlikely as well. England, however, had multiple territories in the Western Hemisphere, and actually had the power to go to war with the US and threaten the homeland should they choose to do so, although they too had very little reason for war with the US. So this was War Plan Red. War Plan Red also had 5 subcategories: Emerald for Ireland, Garnet for New Zealand, Scarlet for Australia, Ruby for India, and of course Crimson for Canada. War Plan Red was first created in 1927 and saw some updates up through World War II actually, and you can find the PDF of the plan with the link in the description, and this version I'm looking at appears to be from 1935, so some details actually get added on into later versions, which sometimes I'll cite in this video. So, what were the actual plans in War Plan Red? The main assumption of the plan was a war between the United States and England and her various colonies, including Canada. The concept of the war is outlined in the report, where they are expecting, quote, a war of long duration involving the maximum effort of the armed forces and civil power of the United States, directed initially toward the isolation of Canada from the United Kingdom and the defeat of the United Kingdom armed forces in North America and the western North Atlantic, including the Caribbean Sea and West Indian waters, and finally toward the economic exhaustion of the United Kingdom. In keeping with Mahan's earlier views, America's naval inferiority to England, even at this time, constrained American operations mostly to the Western Hemisphere, especially the Atlantic. The main concerns were targeting of America's outlying possessions, namely the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and the Panama Canal, as well as an invasion of the contiguous US from Canada. Through seizing these areas, as well as damaging the American economy via blockade, the English could force an American surrender, resulting in the loss of America's holdings. To prevent this, America aimed to address the most dire threat first: Canada. First, America had to isolate Canada from England. Then it had to invade strategic points of the country to rob it of its industrial and logistical capabilities, hopefully forcing a surrender. To do this, America would primarily focus on 4 fronts, with the easternmost being most decisive. One of the primary operational concerns was the UK being able to send troops to Canada to reinforce existing defenses and build up for an invasion of America. However, while Canada has a massive coast, and it may be hard for the US to, keep England from all this area, only a few places are ice-free year-round, and only the southern part of the country has dense enough logistical capacity, roads and rail lines, to facilitate a good defense, and of course the vast majority of the population is in that area as well. It doesn't really do you a whole lot to just hold, Baffin Island or something, because it's just, there's nothing there, right? Therefore, the English were actually somewhat limited in where they could land and resupply Canada effectively. The primary city of importance for this was Halifax, which had a naval base and is ice-free year-round, while also being connected to the rest of Canada via rail. To take Halifax, the US wanted to rely on joint operations, where the Navy and Army would work together to take the objective. While this seems simple enough, 2 totally different command structures working together on this scale was often quite difficult, and entire organizations are usually needed to coordinate between the 2 even to this day. In this era, this joint body was called the Joint Board, led by 3 high officers from each branch, and the Joint Board is actually the group that came up with most of these color plans, since most of these plans generally required action by both branches of the military. Also, just worth noting here that at this point in history, the Marines were part of the Navy and the Air Force was part of the Army, hence why there's only two branches in this joint board. Anyways, the US Navy would focus on concentrating in and then securing the northwestern Atlantic and cutting off the vital Canadian ports from England, delaying or entirely blocking reinforcements and cutting undersea cables for communication. Once that was done, the Navy would move on Halifax. From here, it got a little tricky, as taking Halifax would be difficult no matter what. The main plan here was actually to conduct a beach landing and take the city and port that way, with an alternative plan to push in from land, and another plan just to bomb the crap out of Halifax and make it unusable. All of these would require the Army, which estimated needing 25,000 men here, and the seizure of this area would be hard given the fickle nature of coastline, abundance of inland waterways making it easily defensible, and they had trouble zoning in on one spot to actually land. They ended up deciding St. Margaret's Bay though. The Army would also be responsible for taking Moncton, seizing the rail line here, connecting Newfoundland with the rest of Canada. Notably, War Plan Rad allows for the use of chemical weapons in Halifax, although it is worth noting that they say it would only be used if international conventions would allow for it. The second front would be into the Quebec province. The US would launch up to 3 groups northward to take Montreal and Quebec. From Jackman, Maine, a group would move north to Quebec City. From St. Johnsbury, Vermont, another group would move north to Sherbrooke and then split and hit 3 crucial points on the St. Lawrence River. And then from Fort Allen, Vermont, as well as Plattsburgh and Malone, New York, a third force would move up through Farnham and St. John's around Montreal. Taking these cities would totally isolate the Canadian eastern seaboard, preventing materiel or personnel reinforcements from inland, while the Eastern Front dealt with the hard invasion. The third front was in the Great Lakes region and also would have seen land invasions to secure the Great Lakes choke points and Canada's main industrial centers. The US would focus on the 4 mainland crossings in the Lakes region: Niagara on the Welland Canal, the Detroit River, the St. Clair River, and Sault Ste. Marie to the north. Once these were secured, the US would be able to guarantee better logistics for itself in the war, both commercially and militarily. Plus, like the American Rust Belt right below it, Canada's Ontario region was its center of industry. American forces would capture the peninsula to further cripple Canada's warfighting capability. The fourth main front was in Winnipeg. Winnipeg held Canada's critical rail junction, allowing men and supplies to effectively move from one end of the massive country to the other. Grain from the east went west, and western coal supplied the east. By pushing from North Dakota, the US thought it could relatively easily seize this critical point, dissecting the country yet again. Once these were taken care of, there would also be a push to take Canada's nickel mines in Sudbury, which the US was actually very dependent on. A fifth, less decisive front was on Canada's west coast, namely Vancouver and St. Rupert, which were connected to the rail lines, with the former being a naval base. Some invasion plans here existed, but unless the other fronts saw easy victories, it was generally assumed that an American naval presence here would just be sufficient. Outside of Canada, the US would operate on other fronts as well. Defenses would be made at the most likely landing points in the northeast, namely around Boston and New York, and whatever manpower and naval defenses were possible were to be sent to America's territories, most notably Hawaii and the Panama Canal, where 40,000 men were to be ready. In the Caribbean, the Navy would also seize English naval bases and follow up with Army occupation of those places, most notably Jamaica, the Bahamas, Bermuda, along with smaller holdings like Trinidad and St. Lucia. Once these things were taken care of, America would focus on harassing English commercial shipping and causing enough economic trouble to force England to surrender. The US Navy would also harry the English fleet in the Northwest Atlantic and engage decisively if a good opportunity came. Obviously, this never came to fruition, and America would go on to work alongside England again in World War II. Unlike War Plan Red, War Plan Orange predicted the upcoming war, although the plan itself had been scrapped by that point. Interestingly, there was another even more important war plan that America made, called War Plan Red-Orange. If you can't guess, this assumed a two-front war between both England and Japan in both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. While this too never happened, it actually was a valuable exercise for American military command, since it simulated fighting two enemies on two different sides of the world at once, especially in the oceans. Red-Orange had actually predicted in the event of a war like this, the US couldn't be offensive on both ends at once, and would have to defend in one theater while going offensive in the other. As it turned out, America would end up being able to go offensive on both sides, largely because they were fighting not the powerful Royal Navy, but the Kriegsmarine, which was much smaller. Indeed, the UK's navy was critical in allowing effective supply from America to England, and without it, the war may have dragged on longer than it did. In 1974, War Plan Red was declassified and made public. This was a bit of surprise to everyone else, especially because England didn't really have a War Plan Red equivalent, and this planning war for funsies dynamic really only went one way. Some historians have even taken this to prove that the American military has been eternally wary of England after the Revolutionary and 1812 wars, although, as we talked about earlier, that's not really what was going on. War Plan Red was born out of a need for strategic thinking and developing plans against the most powerful foe that America could think of, which happened to be England. Okay, but now let's talk about Panama and Greenland, the two more serious goals of Donald Trump, apparently. We never made color plans for either of these two places explicitly, although we've had something similar. America engaged War Plan Indigo 3 during World War II. Then, like today, Iceland was a critical point for cross-Atlantic travel, especially by air, and early in the war, England actually occupied Iceland to protect it from Germany. Iceland actually wasn't that happy about this, even though they didn't really fight over it, and plans were made for America to take over the occupation instead. A few different versions of this plan existed here, hence Indigo 3, 3 different versions, but eventually the US pulled it off. This, of course, wouldn't be the case for Greenland today, since a lot of Indigo 3 was just coordination with another military on taking over installations, not taking the place over or annexing it. While Greenland didn't get a color plan, though, the US actually did militarily occupy Greenland during World War II. After Denmark was occupied by the Germans in 1940, Greenland was isolated and kind of in political limbo. But since it was in the Western Hemisphere, it fell under the Monroe Doctrine, which forbade European colonies from changing hands, and put America in charge of colonies in those cases. Plus, the local government and Danish ambassador asked America to do that. Initially, America sent quote-unquote civilianized Coast Guard units to the area, mostly to secure a cryolite mine and act as its quote-unquote private security, so as not to break America's neutrality. But when Greenland officially became an American protectorate the next year, the Navy went in and airfields were actually established. At the same time, Germany wanted to develop weather stations in Greenland's northeast coast, since most weather systems that go through Europe start in that area, and knowing weather is kind of important for military planning, as we would see with D-Day years later. Plus, the English weren't really just giving over weather reports to the Germans, and this was before satellites, so they had to do it themselves. Over the next few years, a game of cat and mouse played out between German, English, American, Greenlandic, and Danish groups as Germany tried to set up covert stations, and the Allies tried to take them down. In March of 1943, a Dane was even killed by Germans at Sandodden, the only casualty in what became known as the Weather War. After the war, America still maintained an air base there, and we still actually have it to this day. Again, though, we see that this wasn't really an invasion, but rather a mutual effort between local and American entities to transfer control of the island. I think an approach like that is infinitely more likely than a military takeover, and that's, how it's being billed. Not many people are saying we're gonna, go in and conquer Greenland. It's more just, they decide to want to be with us. That being said, the circumstances are far less dire now than they were back in World War II. Regarding Panama,
I didn't want to bring up the Panama Canal.
there wasn't a specific plan here either, but there were generalized plans for Central and South America. In particular, War Plan Gray had taken elements from previous and ongoing American interventions in Latin America. Gray mainly called for the occupation of key cities and military installations rather than a generalized occupation of the whole country. In the case of Panama, this would of course include the canal. And of course, we have actually invaded Panama and many other Latin American nations before, but that's a whole other video. So, if Donald Trump wanted to use military force...
Are you also considering military force to annex and acquire Canada?
No. Economic force.
To take Canada, Greenland, and Panama, would he use War Plan Red, or Indigo, or Gray? Probably not. Technology has just advanced so much. I don't think a lot of the concerns we had then would actually be an issue. It would probably actually be easier to do now than it was at the time. If anything, the fact that Canada and Denmark are part of NATO makes the bigger issue all of the European countries that would be obliged to support them. As for the taking of Panama, that wouldn't be that hard, but the hard part would be ensuring that no one just destroys the canal, which would take a long time to fix. They could just throw a ship sideways into it or something. I don't know. We've seen it work before. All in all, it is interesting to see how America planned for wars as we were becoming a superpower. The difficulties foreseen, the strategies and tactics used, and of course, which nations we planned against and why. Personally, I don't think America is actually going to be undertaking any military interventions in Greenland or Panama or Canada or anything. That would just be absurd, but, hey, weird stuff happens, so who knows? Hopefully not. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.